In the year 2000, the world was introduced to what would become and still is the best-selling video game console of all time, the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 was a lot of things. It was the introduction of new gameplay styles, worlds bigger than we'd ever seen before, and it was the perfect opportunity for new series to not only begin, but blossom. Unfortunately, this time period was also one where a lot of things were left behind in the 90s. One example was the Dreamcast, which launched in 1999 in the West. It only had 2 years of life before being crushed by Sony and Microsoft. Sega's hardware days were over. Another example is the turn-based JRPG. Of course, we had things like Pokemon carrying the corpse of the genre throughout the 2000s, and a few rare notes like Lost Odyssey, but for a while there, it seemed like turn-based games were stuck either on handhelds or simply ports of old games. It seemed like the days of getting a big, high-budget console turn-based JRPG were slowly coming to an end. All throughout the 90s, the amount of excellent turn-based JRPGs was overwhelming, and it's no wonder why many people still say that the best games in that genre are from that decade. In the early days of the PlayStation 2, there were a small handful of games that felt like a swan song to the golden age of JRPGs, like The Last Hurrah. One of those was, of course, Final Fantasy X, a wonderful game that has everything a lover of the genre like me wants. Great music, a fun cast of characters, an interesting progression mechanic, a fantastic story, fun fast combat, and at the time, the best graphics we had seen in a Final Fantasy game. And then there's X-2, its direct sequel, which came out in 2003. And it's still, to this day, 20 years later, the last turn-based mainline, is this technically mainline? Final Fantasy game. And when you look at how Final Fantasy has stumbled over the past 20 years, it does make you wonder if leaving turn-based in the past was the right call. If you ask most people what the last great single-player Final Fantasy game is, they would probably say either 12 or 10. Final Fantasy X was and still is beloved by fans of the series and the genre. The game is very sad, and fitting in right with that is the feeling that this game was one of the biggest goodbyes we could imagine. Soon after 10, Squaresoft would be purchased by Enix to become Square Enix, which, as somebody who's played a lot of their games, I feel like this was a huge turning point for them. Not exactly in a great way. JRPGs were also super fun to read through the manuals, as you usually got a map, character descriptions, and a story synopsis, but those days were also slowly coming to an end. Like I said, 10 is a very special and beautiful game draped with this veil of sadness, and it kinda chokes me up sometimes to think about it, not only because of the story, but with how much of a turning point it was. Final Fantasy X is also the reason another game struggled to reach the very same audience. But before we get to that game, let's go back to 1991. In 1991, a man named Hiroki Kikuta joined Squaresoft. His major contributions were the soundtracks for Secret of Mana, Trials of Mana, and Japan exclusive Sokagai. That's right, he's the guy responsible for bangers like this. After his tracks for Sokagai were finished, Kikuta decided to leave Square and form his own development team called Saknoth. The reason he left is because he wanted to have a more hands-on approach in game development rather than just composing music. He wanted to actually design the games. He's quoted as saying that composing music is like breathing for him, but designing a game is like a wish for him. Due to Squaresoft being very strict in its employees' roles and overall structure, Kikuta wasn't able to climb the ladder as fast as he wanted, thus the creation of Saknoth. The first game by Saknoth, directed by Kikuta, was an obscure PS1 RPG called Kudelka. Kikuta wanted to blend horror and JRPGs, and did extensive reading and even a trip to Wales to study architecture. During development, Kikuta wanted to stray away from certain design philosophies he saw at Squaresoft, but others on the staff, also from Squaresoft, felt that they should emulate those philosophies. Unfortunately for him, the game released to middling reviews, and he soon stepped down as CEO of Saknoth and then left altogether. While Kikuta failed to make a big splash with Kudelka, Kudelka still made some ripples in the water, which would soon become a decently sized wave. A spin-off series was born from Kudelka, still fusing horror and RPGs. You see, 5 days before Final Fantasy X launched, came out a little game called Shadow Hearts. Shadow Hearts takes place in 1913, China and Europe. It combines elements of Lovecraftian and Gothic horror. In it, you explore abandoned castles, graveyards, mental hospitals, and other atypical settings for a JRPG. It's not a very horrifying game, however. If you really want to see a great blend of JRPG and horror, I would recommend Parasite Eve, because in Shadow Hearts, there's a level of campiness, quirkiness, and comedy that especially shines during the banter between party members. I think the opening scene is a prime example of this. We're shown this train on which a young woman is being escorted somewhere. Then this old man in a top hat and suit comes out of nowhere and just starts fucking eviscerating everybody, kidnaps her, and then this young guy in a black trench coat who's trying to seem cool barely escapes from this horrifying old guy with the girl. It's both unsettling and hilarious with its absurdity. Then of course you have typical for the time JRPG humor where the guy tries to make an uncomfortable move on the girl. Probably not the best way to show off your protagonist in the first few minutes, and then to counter that, 20 minutes into the game, you're in a village of cannibals and it's really creepy. Mind you, the events in this game all take place a year before the real-world assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which led into World War I directly, which yes is referenced in this game. Shadow Hearts is a game that definitely offers a unique tone matched with its setting. For a game that oftentimes makes corny, outdated gay jokes that have not aged well, it's interesting that it also has a color palette mostly consisting of blacks, grays, purples, and reds. And also there's this battle theme, which I can't tell if it's more catchy than it is annoying. I think it's slightly more annoying, but either way, it's iconic. You play as Yuri Hyuga, a young man who is a harmonixer, somebody who can summon the souls of monsters and fuse with them. This allows Yuri to take on their shape and their abilities. Not only does he not know what happened to his father who disappeared many years ago, he is also plagued by this voice in his head who is guiding him and telling him to do weird things, such as saving the girl on the train. Who this voice is and why it's telling him to do such things, Yuri has no idea. Alice Elliott is the girl Yuri saved on the train from that psychotic old man. She's your typical good girl JRPG character, kind of like a watered down Aerith. Her father was recently killed and she's being hunted down by the old man for some power she was born with. And then there's Roger Bacon, who apparently is named after a 13th century real world philosopher. I don't know. He's the old man who's trying to take Alice. You have no idea who this man is and why he's after her. In typical fashion for the genre, throughout your journey you bump into and befriend an eclectic bunch, such as Margaret, a Russian bombs expert with a good heart. She's my favorite character. There's also Zuzan, a very old exorcist, Keith Valentine, a bored vampire, and Hallie, a poor orphan with telekinetic powers. Since the Super Nintendo era, and mostly starting with Final Fantasy IV, JRPGs became heavily known for their stories. Compared to something like Super Mario World, Final Fantasy IV and VI were almost like books, with so much text in them and the slowness of combat. So it makes sense that games like this needed compelling plot points to suck the player in. But even then, a plot can only do so much, as there's usually a well-known meme about JRPGs that you gather like the weirdest bunch of characters to kill God. And to be perfectly honest, that's what happens here in Shadow Hearts. I would definitely recommend playing Shadow Hearts more for the minute-to-minute plot points and story beats rather than the overall story. Because like I said, you're exploring a cannibal village, a seaside village haunted by a ghost, an abandoned vampire's castle, which is one of the main things that kept me going. It's very Transylvanian, very Castlevania. I just love stuff like that. But like I said, a plot can only do so much. So of course you also need a unique spin on the turn-based battle system. Almost every JRPG starting in the mid-Super Nintendo era tried their unique combat system. The only series to stay very traditional is Dragon Quest, which is awesome in itself. The best way to summarize Shadow Hearts is Paper Mario for adults. Every action you take, whether it be basic physical attacks, magic attacks, or even using an item, yes, using items too, will take you to this circle called the Judgment Ring. In the Judgment Ring, there are colored spaces, which a spinning line will very quickly enter and leave. You have to press X while the line is in the colored space. To add another layer on that, there's a smaller colored space within the colored space, and if you get the line to stop in that small colored space, you'll do bonus damage, or if you're using a healing item, you'll do bonus healing. What I like is the more powerful magic you're trying to use, the harder the Judgment Ring layout will be. The same will also apply for physical attacks. If you fully upgrade a piece of equipment or a weapon, the Judgment Ring colored spaces will get smaller. Sometimes you'll have 4 little colored spaces, and even though you might hit the first 3, if you miss the last space, you lose the turn. No damage done. It's really frustrating, but it also keeps you so engaged because you don't want to slip up once. Physical attacks are slightly more forgiving because there's multiple spaces and each space counts as one hit. So if you hit the first 2 spaces and miss the third, you'll still hit the enemy twice, but you could have hit them 3 times. Items is where it could get a little stressful. 9 times out of 10, using an item on the Judgment Ring is really easy, but if you're stressed or nervous or not paying attention, if you miss that little space, you won't be able to use the potion you need on your weakened character. And this gets even more exciting later in the game when you're fighting difficult bosses. Like, imagine you have 2 weakened characters and one character you're trying to use potions on both of them, but you're just so stressed out or you're nervous that you miss that colored space. It adds so much to the battles. We're not quite done with the Judgment Ring yet, because there's also items you can use to affect the Judgment Ring, such as making the color spaces a little bit bigger, making the line spin slower, making the color spaces give you like triple damage. And what's awesome is you can stack these items for insane combos. Like in one instance late in the game, I used an item that made the entire Judgment Ring a colored space for 3 turns, and then I used another item that tripled my damage. So basically I could just press X anywhere on the ring and do massive damage. But the enemies can also negatively affect your Judgment Ring, making the line invisible or move stupidly fast. The Judgment Ring can also surprisingly be used in stores if you find hidden collectibles. By spinning it in a store, you can buy items and weapons for cheaper than retail price and sell your old items for higher than resale price. It's a really cool idea that they did that. It was nice trying to buy all new armor and weapons for my characters at the cheapest price possible. I have some experience with Paper Mario and the Mario and Luigi games, so I thought something like this would get old after a while. But since the game is a nice brisk 25 hours, offers a lot of items, status effects, and variations to the Judgment Ring, it stayed interesting and spicy all throughout my playthrough. There's also the Malice system, which sounds a lot more annoying than it actually is. Malice is like this negative energy that builds up after you kill a lot of monsters and demons, and you have to go back to this very small hub screen where you basically fight a weak mini-boss to cleanse the Malice. I honestly have no idea what the point of the Malice was, as it seems separate from the 6 core elements. Okay, so there's 6 core elements that each give Yuri a different spirit to fuse into, and if you kill monsters that correlate with that specific element, you also get that specific type of XP to get the next level fusion of that element. As I'm reading this script, I feel like I'm making the system sound really complicated, but trust me, they're not. You will get the hang of all of this within like an hour of playing Shadow Hearts. I also just want to say that we're very quick to shit on JRPGs with annoying random encounter rates, and we should be. Constantly being interrupted when you're just trying to pass one single screen in a JRPG can be annoying as hell. Like, I was just recently playing Legend of Dragoon, and I actually dropped it about 25 hours in because I just couldn't take how slow the game felt. Shadow Hearts might just have the best random encounter rate I've ever seen. I was sometimes able to pass 2 to 3 screens with no battles. And I know this is a hot debate in the community. Some people would probably ask me, why am I playing a JRPG if I don't want a ton of the actual combat? But here's the thing, I do. I must have fought 200 to 300 battles in my playthrough of Shadow Hearts. But I just don't want it constantly interrupting my flow in the game. It's also a sign of how balance is throughout the game. Because think about it, if I have to fight a battle every 5 seconds just to keep up with the next boss, doesn't that mean XP is almost valueless? There's nothing worse than seeing a treasure chest at the edge of your screen and going through like 2 or 3 battles simply to walk down that hallway, open it, and then walking back. That's really annoying. That's why I really like these PS1 ports that Square has been doing, where you can basically shut off encounters, because it gives you the best of both worlds. It allows you to just explore a dungeon and enjoy the art and the music and the overall ambience and vibe. But if you just want to play the freaking game and fight a bunch, you just click a button. But luckily, Shadow Hearts handles all of this very well as overall playtime. Like I said earlier, it only took me 25 hours to beat this game, and roughly 3 of those hours was me grinding out Yuri's fusions, which, thanks to the Judgment Ring, grinding kept me more engaged rather than if I was just pressing X the whole time mindlessly. There's no boring padding to be found anywhere in this game. And honestly, we need more JRPGs under the 30-hour mark. The third key thing that kept me glued to Shadow Hearts was the party. I really like how different they look and how they banter with one another. Yuri and Zuzan almost have a Jiraiya and Naruto type relationship. There's a mutual respect, but also a family-like tendency to just get on each other's nerves. Hallie is the little kid of the group who is very much so connected to the main plot of this game and another game in the franchise. Margaret is like the cool older sister of the group. Alice and Yuri start off as strangers, become friends, and then lovers, I guess. To be honest, the romantic relationship here is not explained or shown very well, unlike Final Fantasy X. Keith I was super excited to have because I'm a fucking sucker for traditional vampires, but sadly he was pretty underdeveloped. He was just a bored vampire. But honestly, he's a great fighter, so if you just want a cool ass vampire in your party to just beat up monsters, he's your guy. I like what I got of these characters bouncing off of each other in the dialogue, but I definitely could have used a tiny bit more. So generally speaking, if this game is 25 hours, I definitely would have been happy with a solid 27, 28 hours if just throughout the game they sprinkled in some more scenes of the characters just bonding. Am I going to go as far as saying that this is one of my all-time top 5 JRPG parties? No. But they're all pretty cool and unique, and they kept me more hooked than the actual story. Okay, so now that I've got the gameplay and plot out of the way, why do I keep comparing this to Final Fantasy X? Because while Final Fantasy X felt like a farewell to the JRPGs we had been playing all throughout the 90s, it was also the start of something new. In Final Fantasy X, most of the dialogue was voiced, and most backgrounds were not pre-rendered for the first time in series history. Pre-rendered backgrounds are some of my favorite art in video games. They're just a vibe, and usually filled with so many little details. They brought the games of the PS1 to life. For those who don't know, a pre-rendered background is just a static background image that your character can walk over. There's benefits and negatives to it. The benefits are, like I said, the details. The negatives are how you sacrifice movement, so things like trees don't move in the wind or ocean waves don't move. I still feel like it's worth the sacrifice because every background really gives each town or dungeon its own character. It almost feels like a mini art style for each location. Even though I talked about it negatively a minute ago, just look at Legend of Dragoon's backgrounds. I'm not even crazy about this game, but I could just see the areas in my head, hear that music, remember what was going on in the story. Shadow Hearts uses pre-rendered backgrounds, non-voice dialogue except for like 3 or 4 awkward instances, and a simple level up XP mechanic. It doesn't try to get overly creative and reinvent the wheel like the sphere grid in Final Fantasy X, which is so good, it's so good. There's also just a nice level of detail throughout this game in multiple small aspects, like how in the beginning when Yuri fuses into a monster, he grabs his head and starts shaking. He looks like he's seriously in pain doing this, but later in the game he just confidently does it. Or how in this one haunted village, there was this girl who unfortunately got cursed and traded voices with her dad, and when you end up fighting her, her grunts and attack sounds are that of an older man. I know it sounds like nothing nowadays, but a lot of times when you play older games, those small details slip through the cracks. So take a unique setting, semi-dark tone, interesting characters, a classic but not annoying game feel, and you have a damn good JRPG that feels fresh out of that PS1 era, except on PS2. You have Shadow Hearts. It's kind of like when a rock band comes out and they release like an album or two and everyone says, oh, these are the best albums that they've ever come out with. Meanwhile, later in the discography, they became way better musicians and are playing objectively more complex music. People just love those earlier albums. So if things like Final Fantasy VII, Legend of Dragoon, Legend of Legaia, stuff like that on the PS1 were those earlier albums, something much more rough but still very enjoyable, Shadow Hearts is an album that came out way later in the discography that's often overlooked but is just a perfect version of those older things. Sometimes something can be good or great without trying too hard. Yeah, sometimes you want the fancy burger with the bacon, aioli, brioche bun, and truffle fries, but other times you just want a damn basic cheeseburger and french fries. I used to be really in on that debate of which era of JRPGs was better, Super Nintendo era or PS1 era. The Super Nintendo era had some bangers like Final Fantasy IV, 6, Chrono Trigger, Dragon Quest 4 and 5, Earthbound, but damn, the PS1 era was just pumping these games out like they were freaking easy to make. Going to the game store, buying that new turn-based JRPG in the shrink wrap, popping it into your console to play on the big TV, it was a common feeling that seemingly would never go away. But very quickly in the 21st century, turn-based JRPGs faded away like a sunset. In the mid-2000s, if you wanted a turn-based JRPG, you would have to play ports on the GBA/DS or if you were lucky, a few original games like Golden Sun or Radiant Historia. The Shadow Hearts series is sad for a few reasons. It's sad that Hiroki Kikuda's vision for Kudelka was considered a failure. It's sad that the perfection of the PS1 formula went unnoticed in the early aughts of the PS2 days. And it's sad that the series faded away after only 2 more games. People like to throw the word masterpiece around pretty lightly, and I've seen a few people online say that about Shadow Hearts. And while I definitely wouldn't go that far, what I will say is that this game doesn't deserve to be forgotten or fall into obscurity. This game doesn't deserve to only be playable still on the PS2 today. It should be on the PSN. Because this is a damn great game. Is it better than Final Fantasy X? Fuck no, hell no. Is it a really solid game that deserves to be played? Absolutely. And I'm very, very excited to later in this year play Shadow Hearts Covenant, the direct sequel to Shadow Hearts that many people say is one of the greatest JRPGs on the PlayStation 2. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, if you like turn-based JRPGs, if you know anybody who does, please consider liking, subscribing, sharing this video, commenting. It means everything to me. Thank you very much.